welcome everyone to our second episode of the She Plus Tech Table, where we explore stories, strategies, and innovations shaping the entrepreneurial landscape. And today we're going to Africa, going to dive into Beyond Capital, Rethinking Funding and Support for African Startups. We'll explore why traditional venture capital often struggles to align with African realities and how alternative funding models and ecosystem support can make a difference, and what it really takes to build successful startups that address the continent's unique challenges. And my guest today is an expert in this area. She brings very deep insights into these topics and will share examples, lessons, and some practical strategies for founders who are looking to thrive in Africa's dynamic startup ecosystem. I'm so happy to welcome my guest, Mbachu, pulling up a chair to the She Plus Tech Table. Round of applause for
Yay!
her. I'm excited to
So happy to be
welcome
here, Onan.
Linda. Thank you so much.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
having me.
That's wonderful. So we're going to start this conversation today with you telling us a little about yourself. Can you give us a little tidbit into your journey, how you started, how
Yeah.
you got here?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, there's been like 10 plus years of what led me up to this point. But how I would describe myself is I am a venture builder. I am an ecosystem enabler. I have worked over the past couple of years designing and leading programs that create ventures that help founders go from ideation to scale. And over the years, I've supported, or led programs rather that have supported 1,000 plus founders globally, predominantly also African founders across Southern, Eastern, and Western Africa. And I'm proud to say, obviously, that I've supported these founders with coaching, but also really ensuring that they have access to capital, whether that is non-equity and equity capital. I am currently the founder of Catalyst Ventures, which is an innovation ecosystem that comprises of a nonprofit where we do the enabling work, and then a venture studio that does the startup building as well as an investor community, right? Our work within Catalyst Venture really is centered around building inclusive markets and solving really for the affordability challenge, which is really critical on the continent because you have such a huge aspect or segment of the population really that's living below the poverty line, right? So how do we ensure that we're leveraging innovation, we're leveraging technology to bridge that divide, to make them part of our markets, right? And in terms of how I got here, I've spent 10 plus years in international development, working within different sectors from agriculture to the informal economy to the artisan sector. So working with weavers, textile weavers, basket weavers. I'm just really looking at how we can structure different value chains so that again they're inclusive and enabling different actors within the markets to thrive. And over the years, obviously, I've been really passionate about the role of technology and the potential that technology has really in terms of bridging that divide and building more of an inclusive. So really excited to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
That's wonderful. I mean, you've had such a broad range of experience, but even particularly is your experience with having to help African founders and African startups. And you've had experience in that value chain as well. So you,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure, can answer the next question. I understand that a lot of people have wonderful ideas and they want to solve specific problems that are
Mm-hmm.
plaguing Africa, whether it's in technology, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in agriculture. And they have
Mm-hmm.
very beautiful ideas. But then when it comes to funding, there are some restrictions. And we know that traditional venture capital often struggles in Africa. Why do you think that is? I know we've had some exceptions to the case with people like Andela or Money Point and the
Money
rest,
points, yeah.
but we've had things like high risk perception, local market understanding being tossed around.
Yeah.
What is your opinion about what is really happening with venture capital funding in Africa?
Yeah, I think you've already hinted at some of what I was gonna say, to be honest, but I feel like, first of all, the venture capital model was not designed for markets like African markets. right? So if you think
Mm,
about the venture model and the context that we're in, African societies are highly fragmented, the economies rather, they're highly dysregulated. And then even when you think about regulation across different markets, it's very different. It's not sort of, one holistic framework, right? So the one issue with the VC model really is that it is mismatched, right? VC is prioritizing rapid
mm,
growth. It's prioritizing, again, exponential growth under the context that that market is one homogeneous. The purchasing power of those consumers also is there. It exists, right? But we know that in the context of Africa, again, as I mentioned earlier, we have a huge segment of the population that lives below the poverty line. And then the other thing that
mm,
is assumed under the VC model is that there is already an enabling infrastructure, right? So whether that's a physical infrastructure or a digital infrastructure that allows for startups to scale to different markets or even within a local market. So the VC model is already assuming a lot of the things, right? It's assuming homogeneous market. It's assuming that there's a potential purchasing power that exists. It's assuming also that that infrastructure, whether it's a physical infrastructure or whether it's a digital infrastructure, that it exists. But again, we
mm,
see with the context of the continent and being here, I'm seeing this every day, pretty much being here, is that the markets are highly fragmented. Mentioning earlier that I just, went to Senegal and then had to go to Rwanda, and these are entirely different markets within the exact same continent. Different languages, even within
mm,
one country, you have different peoples within that country, different, incentives that drive behavior and things like that. On the regulation side, again, it's very different. Our behavior is very diverse. And then again, across the board, the informal sector dominates. So how do we actually get data from within the informal sector to actually tell you what your consumer is thinking about or feeling in terms of a particular product? It's very, very difficult. Right. So again, that's one
mm,
issue that I can really mention, which is again there's that mismatch between what inherent in the VC model and what you find on the ground here on the continent. The other point you mentioned earlier as well is the high perception risk, right? And the high perception risk essentially is driven by the fact that a lot of the investors into the continent are foreign investors and they have limited understanding of what our landscape is all about, right? So
mm,
when they are evaluating, investment opportunities and they're looking at startups, they're using frameworks that they use in New York. They're using frameworks that they use in San Francisco, right? For a startup in Accra, Ghana, or Lagos, Nigeria. Again, there already is a mismatch there, right? So you can't really weigh those markets the same way because they don't function the same way, right? And then the other element, again, just giving the fact that these investors have this lack of understanding of like the local context, what that really leads to is that they often then will not see or understand the advantages that the continent has, right? So again, when I say advantage, what do I mean? By advantage, I mean that we have a continent with a market size that is incredibly underpenetrated. So if you look at
mm,
Lagos or Nigeria alone, if you look at the market size of Nigeria, imagine that the infrastructure worked. Imagine that there is electricity. Imagine that there is efficient transportation. Imagine that everything worked the way it should. What would that market penetration look like in terms of goods and services? Massive, right? So I think that VCs on the other end, when they see the challenges, they don't necessarily also see the advantages or the opportunities, I should say, opportunities rather than advantages. They don't see the opportunities that are on the flip side of that. The other element also is that the continent has a very, very young demographic. What does that mean? The young demographic is becoming very digitally savvy. They're very becoming more agile in how they go about doing things, solving problems, innovating, all that stuff, right? So again, because they don't have that everyday understanding of the local market, they're not looking at the other side of it. So they still continue to perceive the market as high risk. And then also because again, within the VC model, there is like a particular framework in terms of how, investors get their return back, right? So there are particular exit pathways essentially, right? So if you look at a VC, they would say, pathways for return on investment would be what IPOs, right? It could be
correct.
mergers, acquisitions, buyouts. When you now look at the context of Africa, it could take a lot longer for a company to get to a point where they're reaching an acquisition. Right? It could take a lot longer for a company to get to the point where they obtain an IPO. So that process of liquidation is longer on the continent than it would be in the US and so forth. And then that also adds to the perception of risk for investors. It's longer not
Yeah.
because the founders are not doing amazingly. It's longer because not because, they're not hard at work. It's again longer because of other things that I mentioned earlier, which is the infrastructure, um, and just understanding the local market as well, and how to really ensure that there's high adoption of whatever solution that they're bringing to market, right? And then one of the other things within the VC model, really, that I see, especially again having worked with founders in Canada and founders that are coming from Europe and different parts of the world, is that when you're building or solving for a problem, you're solving for like one particular problem, right? Like you're looking at one particular
Yep.
value chain,
Mm-hmm.
right? But in the context, again, because as I mentioned, like the infrastructure is not there for us. So when you see a founder who is building a logistic platform, there might eventually also be a fintech element to it because they have to build the financial aspect of that, right? How does money flow within that platform? They might have to build it out, right? If they're building out logistics or whichever other platform. So it's really rare to see a startup where they're just saying, oh, we're just in fintech, right? It could be fintech and then employee management or whatever the case. It might be SME management and then something else, right? But again, because the infrastructure is in there, these founders are having to build it so that it enables what they're actually trying to solve for, right? So I think all of these different elements are things that are very particular to the African landscape that's not inherent within the VC model. And when VCs come in and founders are working across all of this, it might appear as though, these founders are doing way too many things. Like, why don't you just focus on this? Why are you doing logistics and fintech? Why can't you just do fintech? But yeah, if I need to do fintech or if I need to do logistics, I have to do
You
this.
need.
I need fintech, right? So I think a lot of elements within our local context kind of goes against what, a traditional VC would want or would want to see. And that obviously adds to the element of like, or the perception of high risk, so to speak. But yeah, I mean, I would say like those are some of like the elements and pieces that I see on the continent in terms of, the VC
At the
model itself
challenges.
and the challenges. Yeah.
Yeah, so the argument will be that even with all these challenges, there are some founders or some startups that
Mm,
have thrived and have quote unquote made it. So apart from VC funding, what would you recommend are the other ways that
mhm,
people can get funding? So what are alternative funding models?
mm.
So what options do they have available despite all of these problems?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There are other alternative models that are emerging, and I've been, it's been exciting, like really seeing like how some of these models play out. We have catalytic capital, where it's like a mix, it's essentially capital that enables, founders to move their startups or ventures from like one stage to another without that pressure of like having to ensure returns to investors. We have community-driven capital, and that's something again that I've seen quite a bit of, and that is very much driven also by diaspora, right? So you see a lot of diasporas they've done a lot of work in innovation in tech across different parts of the world, and they're thinking about how do we then now pool our capital to support founders on the continent. And again, a lot of them also are thinking about this from that perspective of remittance, right? So we know that the continent receives a humongous amount of remittances on an annual basis, but it's really difficult to actually track the impact of that, right? So you find young African in the diaspora who are thinking about these different ways of leveraging community to now drive capital to founders through different types of platforms. And then you also have like different blend mechanisms, right? That also works. It could be a combination of debt. It could be a combination of equity capital, grants, whichever is the case. One thing I can say with the community driven capital, this is something also that kind of emerges as a question or criticism of venture capital model, is that the community led capital model, essentially, or crowdfunding pretty much, basically encourages more local participation, right? And it also encourages more shared ownership in terms of local shared ownership. one of the criticism that we've seen in the past with VC model is that, a lot of the investors are coming from outside of the continent, which then means that once the startup does all the work, they've scaled from, MVP to now product market fit to, pre-seed to Series A, and all these foreign investors are coming in. The return on all of that work obviously leaves the continent, right? So with community-driven capital, there's also this added question of how do we actually ensure that the benefits, the return of this economy stays within the local market. And then
Mm,
the other element of that also is the question of dependency. How do we then reduce dependency on foreign investors, right? Because foreign investors, as we discussed earlier,
mm,
they have this perception of high risk. They don't necessarily know the terrain a lot unless they've done a lot of work on the continent. So there's that question of how do we now reduce a lot of dependency on foreign investor and ensure that we have more localized capital within the venture space, right? So within the community-driven model, there's that element. So you have, platforms like Hoke that come together and, they basically bring diasporans from the UK, from the US, even within the continent to come on as investors in different African startups. So you have that localized capital and things like that, right? There are other, I think this, I actually really like this model that I'm going to talk about, which is like the revenue-based model, right?
okay.
So, um, revenue-based model would be rather than giving up equity. So as myself as a founder, I've built up my business up, out of pocket for the next year or for the past 1 year, a year and a half. I get an investor at a pre-seed stage or seed stage. Rather than saying I'm actually selling a part of the business and giving 5% or 15% of that business, I get the investment and then I'm repaying that investment through a percentage of revenue, right, on set multiples. Which so let's say if the investor requested like a 3 times return, then I'll pay onto that 3 time investment. That multiple is reached for the investor, but I still own my business 100%. I still have that equity,
Mm,
right? So there's that revenue-based financing that I think we need to leverage a bit more because I think also that drives founders to actually focus on the core of the business, like what is going to drive revenue, right? One of the challenges that I've seen with the VC model is like you have startups that have raised pre-product, there's no revenue, and they have this incredible valuation. But like at the end of the day, if your business doesn't have revenue, is it really a business, right? But
mm,
with a revenue-based model, you actually have businesses that are really driving towards revenue. And again, when I say revenue, it's like you're showing value, right? Like you think as a business, I have value to the customer, I have value in this market, so people are actually willing to pay for that service. So there's that element of revenue-based financing that I actually really like because it protects the founder, it protects the startup, they get the capital that they need without giving out equity, but then it also helps them really prioritize revenue because at the end of the day, they have to return a certain multiple to that investor and ensure that the investor is happy. Maybe that investor might want to come back and run it back, right? So that's another model that I would really stress. The other piece that I think we should be thinking about a bit more, and I don't necessarily think that I've seen this a lot, is the role of corporate, right? The role of corporate entities on the continent. How can they now come in as early stage funders, right? So not just necessarily for return, but looking at the innovation pipeline. So for a startup, for a corporate company that's in the banking industry, right? How can I keep my eyes out for fintechs that are solving for problems that I am experiencing? I can now invest in that product, or I can acquire that product. It becomes part of the bank, and then I continuously build on that. So there are different ways that we can even think about scaling products or scaling solutions where the private sector also has a role as like an investor, whether through acquisition, whichever other means. And then obviously you have, as I mentioned, calculated funding where you can have in some of these cases, let's say you have a startup that is very high impact and has high impact, high revenue potential. Then you can have a lot of development finance organizations that can come in and say, okay, we're investing on the impact side, right? So we invest on return, maybe increase access to education for a number of girls or whatever that impact might be. So there's no equity that's been giving out necessarily. There's no like financial metric that's owed to that particular investor, but you have the impact metric that's owed to that investor, right? So for you now as an impact led founder, You have that catalytic fund from like the development, the FDIs, the development finance institution. And then you can also go to the bank and say, okay, maybe if I have 500K from this institution, I can now just take 20K in debt, so I can take 20K in equity. So I don't give up too much equity too quickly for the business. So that's another thing that another model that I think we should explore quite a bit. Again, just given the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, African startups are not just building apps, like they're actually creating markets, they're solving problems that exist, they're trying to bridge the gap between the informal and the formal sector. They're solving for health, they're solving for education, they're solving for logistics infrastructure, well, that supports or enables access to key essentials, right? So I think when we look at it from that perspective, there are many other models that we could really push forward that's not so VC. So those are some of the models that I see a lot on the continent of this in terms of enabling other forms. And even within the other type that I mentioned earlier, which is more sort of like the, I guess, catalytic funding, you kind of see a lot more like development finance organizations that kind of come into play as well, especially if that startup has an element of impact. So if the startup has the potential for a strong financial return as well as social return. So you see government development arms really that are now investing in innovation in entrepreneurs, right? Like they're giving grants or they'll give some kind of initial early capital. So that's also very exciting to see as well.
That's for funding, but we often hear about the importance of other things, networks, mentorship, technical support, and the like. In fact, I heard somebody say that African founders are the most mentored founders in the world, over mentored. But are you of that opinion, or do you feel like there's still room or space for these other things apart from just capital, apart from just funding? That there are opportunities for mentorship, there are opportunities for opportunity networks, there are opportunities for technical support to make sure that the African startups are getting to where they need to be. What's your opinion on that?
I mean, I have the first like agree and say like I've heard this. I've heard founders complain about mentorship. Where's the money? You just want the money, you
Exactly.
know. But I just feel like it's become such a popular critique, and it's not without reason. It's not without reason because my opinion is that you need a good mix of all of that, right? The African ecosystem is an ecosystem, as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of uncertainties, right? In terms of infrastructure, regulation, like a lot of different things that could enable or hinder the market from actually working. So when it comes to mentorship is really important in the sense that it can help, it's not just mentorship in the traditional sense of let's just sit and go to a workshop or there's a curriculum that will, design this curriculum and execute it across different countries, but like how do you actually create a very customized coaching curriculum for founders in particular markets and particular sectors, looking at their particular challenges. So
Mm,
they have that know-how, right? Of like, if I'm facing this challenge, here's how I approach it. Like within the African context, right? Who is really critical in terms of driving the business forward, right? So non-financial resources are equally as important as financial resources, right? But I think the critical thing is when we talk about mentorship still matters. I really believe that mentorship still matters. But what I would say about mentorship is that it needs to evolve, right? So it needs to be contextualized, it needs to be relevant, it needs to be time bound. So when I say time bound, it needs to be within the context of the business and the stage that we're in. We can't just have a general like incubator program and talking about fundraising and this founder hasn't even like, validated the MVP, right? So we have to really ensure that the mentorship is really curated and contextualized for founders as opposed to just taking Western frameworks and bringing those Western frameworks in the African market. Right. And again, going back to the context of the continent being largely an informal market, how can this early stage founders go about validating? You can't validate your business by sitting around and saying, I'm going to develop a survey and post it somewhere on the internet. I get people to fill it out. You have to be in the field. You have to go out there. You have to meet people. You have to collect data. You have to talk to people to get insights about the product that you're putting out there. You have to validate that they're interested in that product because it solves the problem that they have, right? So the coaching and the mentorship really needs to be contextualized within Africa's own constraints, so to speak. So again, I'm of that mindset that, mentorship is really, really important. capital without the mentorship, again, might end up just being a waste of money because, again, if you have the capital, but you don't have the people to help you open doors, you don't have the people to facilitate access to market, you don't have the people to support with like regulation. So if you're having to move through like regulatory jungle, so to speak, you need to know people that can help you facilitate some of the elements, right? So again, mentorship is critical, capital is critical, connections is highly critical. So all of these three pieces, I think a founder in the African context can deal with, you can't do it without any of them. I just had this thought too, because I feel like oftentimes, especially when you look at programs that are funded by external funders, right? I feel like
Mm.
sometimes we use coaching as like a proxy to mitigate risk, right? So coaching is like, oh, we can't, it's too risky to give them money. It's too risky to do this, to do that. So how about we just create a program and we coach them? Essentially that like when we think about coaching, like that element of it is like super it's super defined, it's super intentional, right? Because again, as I mentioned, coaching without the human capital and networks to open doors is useless. Capital without the coaching can be useless. Capital without the human networks to open doors, again, also can be useless. So having that mix of it is essential.
Yeah, they have to work in tandem with each other, right? To make sure that they're
Yeah,
getting a bouquet of everything that they need to succeed.
I
Yeah, I agree
agree.
with that.
I
I
agree.
really agree with that. Also, I mean, the question will now be with all of these challenges, with all of these
Mm,
alternatives, looking into the future, what does an African startup ecosystem that truly supports founders look like? And how should innovative funding and ecosystem resources play a role in
mm.
that vision? What's the vision here? What will be like the nirvana
So,
for the African startup ecosystem?
mhm, mhm, mhm. That's a really good question, and I think it's a question that will require different members, organizations within the ecosystem to really think about like what's that vision for us, right? As ecosystem builders within the African context. But for me,
Mhm.
I would say let's move away from what that looks like, for example, on the coaching side, and even on the capital side, let's move away from programs to building bridges, right? So how can I create a pathway for founders, right? So if there are so many different accelerators, incubators here in Lagos, how do they feed into each other in terms of providing different types of support, right? So rather than having 10 incubators who are doing the exact same thing and competing for, the funding, investors, competing for like, the pipeline of founders to come into their program, how do you actually streamline that ecosystem to say, okay, if you are early stage, and you need coaching on product, go to this person. If you're
Mm.
early stage and you need coaching on generating revenue and validating the solution, go to this person. If you're a growth stage and you're thinking about entering new markets in East Africa, go to this person, right? So how do we actually create that bridge so that we actually have an ecosystem? Because right now it's like we use the word ecosystem a lot, but it's just a bunch of different organizations that are doing similar work, right? So
Yeah.
is that actually an ecosystem? Is there a network of resources that's been shared? So I think for me, that's what it would look like. It would look like, okay, let's say if you have a pitch competition, and the winners of that pitch competition, what happens to them? Is that the end? Are they just like, okay, you won a competition, that's it, go build your business? Or is it that, okay, you've won a competition by this organization, now you're being pipelined here for coaching, or you're being pipelined to this particular corporate partner for access to market or whatever the case, right? So how do we create those pathways that actually makes an ecosystem? So I think for me, that's what that vision would look like.
I agree. I mean, those enablement channels will make it easy for and even create
Yeah,
clarity for the founders because sometimes with all of
exactly.
these competing needs, you have as an accelerator here, you have an incubator here. It's so confusing because half of the
Yeah.
time they have to squeeze through all of that noise to know
Mm-hmm.
exactly what they need.
Yeah.
And the truth is, half of the time, according to what I've heard, they don't get exactly what they're looking for
What they
because, as
need.
you said, okay,
Right.
after they finish this pitch competition and they get what a
Mm.
few $1,000s, where do they go for the resources to know how to use those dollars? Where do they go for the
Mm.
resources to know how to navigate looking for a co-founder, or how to know when they're market ready, or when to go for the next series of funding, or where to even go to look for those so-called funders, and even to
Mm,
understand with some of the points that you've raised today that the VC model doesn't really work for the African ecosystem, that they should
mm,
explore other alternative sources of funding, as you mentioned, the revenue-based funding and the like. So
yeah.
I'm sure these are some of the things that Catalyst Venture is providing. So just a little tip for those who are listening today. If you're a founder in Africa, She Plus Tech has partnered with Catalyst Venture. They're one of our partners. And if you have an idea, you're a woman, you have an innovative idea that will solve a problem in the continent, they are looking for founders such as yourself. You can reach out to Tina on LinkedIn. Just send her a quick chat, a quick note to say that, hey, this is what I'm building. She'll love to hear from you to know exactly what she's
Absolutely.
passionate about meeting you. Trust me, you're not going to be disturbing her. Just say that you're from She Plus Tech and she'll be able to guide you. The Catalyst Venture as a whole will be able to guide you or direct you to the right resources that you need, even if it has to do with funding, if it has to do with infrastructure, if it has to any area of your startup journey that you want them to discuss with you, they'll be able to do so. I want to thank my guests for coming today, but before I let you go, I have a series of rapid fire questions that I want to ask you. And
Mm,
this is just, just the first answer that comes to your head is what you should give to us today. So we're going to start with drum roll.
okay.
Number one is, if you could work from anywhere in Africa for a month, which city would you pick and why?
Cape Town, um,
Nice.
because of the nature, mountains and beaches, and yeah, I love Cape Town.
Ah, that's awesome. And then the number two is, what's one local dish from anywhere on the continent you could eat every week without getting tired of it?
My favorite dish. I can't. It's called ekwa. And
Okay.
It's a Cameroonian dish, but I
What's it
love it
made of?
as a kid. Made of, it's like cocoyams. You grate the cocoyams and then you wrap it in small leaves, like cocoyam leaves or spinach leaves, and then you just like
Oh.
steam it, cook it in like with palm oil, seasoning, fish. It tastes so good, and especially after like it burns a little bit and you're scraping the pot, like
Hmm.
that burnt part, my favorite.
I think there are similar dishes across Africa because I
I
know
think
that
so.
yes, in the Calabar or Akwa Ibom region of Nigeria, I think they have a similar dish. I can't remember what it's called, but I think they have something similar that they wrap
Mm.
cocoyam in leaf as well.
And
Sounds
like
delicious.
small pieces, right? Like small,
Yes,
yeah.
yes, and then they cook it with I think fish and palm oil as well. So
Yes,
yes,
exactly.
sounds
I
amazing.
love it.
And then number three is, if you were launching a startup in Africa today, what problem would you solve first and why?
This is a hard one because
Hard one.
this is a hard one. I feel like because I have my head in so many different buckets. I see problems and opportunities in so many different spaces. But I'll go back to back in my graduate days when I was working with farmers in South Africa. I was doing research with farmers in South Africa. And one of the things that was really, really painful to watch was, you see this farm, and I interviewed like 100 plus farmers, right? And across the board, these are farmers who are producing substantial amount of crops and growing different vegetables. But at the end of the day, they couldn't sell those products, right?
Oh,
So you had a lot of wastage and things like that. So one of the things that I would want to solve for is that particular problem, and maybe just figure out how to work with cooperatives or different associations, so whether it's like a sugar association or whichever case, to then have like a supplier management platform where I can
mm,
now connect, like train these farmers through like the cooperatives associations to become like exporters of these materials, of these products, but
mm,
essentially just have the digital platform where I'm able to connect farmers to farmers, cooperatives, or aggregators, even to processors, to exporters within their economy, but also to global markets, because there's a lot that's being produced and it's not circulating, right? It's being wasted. And even in the same community, there's a lot that's being produced, and you have people who are they don't have access to food and things like that, right? So I think just finding a way to just make food distribution more transparent, traceable.
That's a good one. That's a good goal. And if there's anybody listening and you have a solution to this or you're building something for that,
Yeah,
reach out to Tina because she's passionate about this particular solution. So
exactly.
anything to do with food security and agriculture, I think is
And I
something
mean,
that,
I feel like I just gave an idea for a product, you know, like
yes, it's a good idea.
I just gave an idea for a product. So
Everyone's listening. This is a good one because can you
yeah,
imagine? And there's a gap there. There's an opportunity
yeah.
there. So I can see that working. So good one. And
Mm.
then what's one African city you think will become the next big startup hub?
I will say car.
Okay. Why is that?
Um, I would say Dakar because I mean I think the new government is making a lot of changes. One of it is that they recently signed a partnership with the Gates Foundation to set up the AI hub. So how is to essentially scale AI innovation across the country. I mean, of course, the Gates Foundation is doing that across different African markets. They're doing that in Rwanda. They're doing that in potentially Nigeria, in Senegal as well. But I think Nigeria and Rwanda have already done a decent job of positioning themselves as an innovation hubs. Like Rwanda is doing a lot more, but I think in terms of, you know, what the next 5 years, 10 years will look like. On the Francophone Africa side, I think Senegal is really starting to invest a bit more into like AI infrastructure, and hopefully we can see that kind of spread right in terms of supporting innovators across the world.
That's a good one. And then
Mm.
the rapid fire question is finish this sentence. The biggest myth about African founders is
They are not competitive enough.
exactly. I agree with that. And on that note, I support that wholeheartedly. On that note, we've come to the end of the session today. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure
Mm,
the audience has learned a lot as well. I just want to thank you immensely for coming on the She Plus Tech table today, for pulling up a chair and sharing your experiences, your knowledge, and giving a tip or two to all those who want to explore possibilities. And as we said
mhm,
earlier, please reach out to Tina. She's on LinkedIn. We're going to drop her handle so that you can reach out to her. You'll be able to discuss
mhm,
everything there is to know about the ideas you have, how to get to MVP, how to raise
mm,
capital, how to explore mentorship, and just how to take your idea to the level of really helping to solve problems in Africa. And we have quite a few of them that have opportunities for you to be able to work on.
mhm.
So thank you once again to my guests. We're grateful to
Thank
have.
you. Thank you for having me. It's been such a pleasure having this conversation and just chatting about the innovation. Yeah.
For now, have yourself a lovely day and enjoy the rest of your week, your day, and just make sure that you're supporting every African founder out there. Have a good one. Bye now.